Hello and welcome to the SEC Breakdown, our weekly college football show. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, cover the Tennessee Vols for the Knoxville News Sentinel. Let's meet our panelists this week.
I'm Josh Vitale, I cover the Auburn Tigers for the Montgomery Advertiser.
I'm Brett Hudson, I cover Alabama for the Tuscaloosa News and TideSports.com.
I'm Marc Weiszer, I cover the Georgia Bulldogs for OnlineAthens.com and the Athens Banner-Herald.
All right, guys, let's look back on week 2 in the SEC. One of the bigger games of the weekend in Georgia and Auburn. Georgia prevailed in that one pretty convincing fashion. I guess what were your two takeaways from that game? Josh, let's start with you and then go to Marc.
I think my biggest takeaway was that you shouldn't read too much into week 1. Because I think that's what a lot of people did. Going into it, looked like Georgia was the team that may have some issues on offense, and Auburn looked pretty good, and that went over Kentucky. And that was not the case in Athens. Auburn pretty much only loses there, and it did so again in pretty convincing fashion. Georgia's defense, we knew it was elite. It looked probably better than elite against Auburn. It dominated both lines of scrimmage, both sides of the ball. They looked like a team that, like everyone thought, and win the SEC East, and Auburn looks like a team that has a lot of work to do going forward in the season because that offense did not look like it had taken any steps forward from last season.
Yeah, I mean, I think Auburn was a trendy pick heading into that game on some of the pregame shows. And, questions about Georgia at the quarterback position, Stetson Bennett making his first start as a Bulldog against a top 10 Auburn team and in prime time with ESPN's top crew. And, the offense couldn't get much push against Arkansas the week before. So there was questions not just about Bennett, but about the offensive line, which lost 4 starters from last year. But, as Josh said, the same dynamic. Auburn came into Athens and couldn't get anything going offensively. And you didn't think there would be much of a home field advantage with the reduced attendance, but it certainly was for Georgia. And they dominated the line of scrimmage. Stetson Bennett was as good as you could have hoped for in terms of running that offense, and Georgia's defense was dominant. So they look like the top 4 team that they are this week in the polls.
Marc, I wanted to follow up with something you said about the home field advantage. There's been a lot of chatter about that from folks who watched the game. I covered Tennessee's noon kickoff, so I was home in time to watch that game. And I will say, from my seat in front of the television, it did look like there were more than 20,000 fans in the stadium. And what do you make of that? Was that a real 20,000 there, or was that number dialed down a little bit?
From the vantage point of the press box, it certainly seemed to be larger than that. Other reporters felt the same way. When I went back and watched the broadcast, Chris Fowler said, it looked like more than a quarter. Now, part of that, talking to Georgia folks on Monday, is the way that they set up the seating in kind of a stair-step fashion, made it seem bigger, they said. Clearly, there were some major issues in the student section on the lower level, and they're going to address that this week. They're going to filter some of the students to 2 other areas of the stadium, and they need to do a better job of monitoring them. Part of the issue they also said was that when the camera for ESPN pans the student section, they gather together. But, if you went to downtown Athens, which I didn't, but I heard on the sidewalks, you'll see people gathering as well when students are out and about at the bars and stuff. So they need to address that this week, and they've made some changes heading into Tennessee.
Coming into the season, Alabama was the favorite to win the SEC. I don't think anything we've seen through 2 weeks suggests that they're not in that position. But what's been your impressions of Alabama so far through their first 2 games?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that the offense isn't regressing like you would reasonably expect it to when they lose a quarterback to the first round of the NFL draft. They lose 2 wide receivers to the first round of the NFL draft and one of their starting tackles. You would expect some offensive regression, but that hasn't been the case through 2 games with Mac Jones at quarterback. He just completed 20 of 27 passes for 435 yards and 4 touchdowns against Texas A&M, averaging 16.1 yards per attempt, which Tua never did. He only averaged 16.0 yards per attempt against UL Lafayette. Never did it against an SEC team. So Mac has already done something that that Tua never did. So the offense is not regressing, which is a big takeaway thus far. They're going to face more talented defenses down the road, to be fair. But on the opposite side of the ball, the defense has improved from last year's unit, but not to the degree that it was expected. There's potential for this to be a dominant defense, maybe not as dominant as the Alabama defenses of earlier in the decade, but there was an anticipation that this could be a borderline dominant defense, and they aren't that right now. Some of it is due to some breakdowns in the secondary. They're replacing 3 starters there. Some of that is due to tackling issues that could and probably should get better over the next 2 or 3 weeks, much like it was last year. The Alabama's offense is very impressive, and its defense needs to improve if it wants to reach the goals that it typically does of being a national championship contender.
And Josh, I wanted to wrap up our thoughts on week 2 by taking a look at Mississippi State. Mike Leach was on top of the world in the SEC for all of 1 week. And then, as Mike Leach tends to do sometimes, he gets his team up for big games, and then the following week, beating LSU, they lose to Arkansas. And I think this kind of plays into what you were saying earlier. A lot of folks made too much of week 1, and that seems to apply to Mississippi State and Mike Leach as well.
When you watch Mike Leach put up the numbers that that offense did at LSU, you're like, all right, they're gonna play Arkansas at home and they're gonna blow them out of the water. But Arkansas defended that air raid really well, rushing 3, getting pressure at 3, dropping 8. Limiting yards after the catch. To hold that offense to 14 points after what it did at LSU was really impressive. To me, it shows that, one, Mike Leach and the air raid isn't going to come and just take over the SEC. I think it's gonna have games like it did against LSU, but there are talented defenses in this league, and it's going to have games where it doesn't put up as many points. And then Arkansas, I don't think many people thought Arkansas would be much of anything this season. It still might not be, but the way that defense played against an offense that had just passed for 600 yards the week earlier was impressive. It's forced 6 turnovers. That was kind of a deflate the balloon a little bit for Mississippi State and maybe inflate it for Sam Pittman in Arkansas, saying, hey, that team can put up points and we just shut them down.
In the game I was at, Tennessee handled Missouri in convincing fashion. Tennessee's offensive line looked really strong, and its running back tandem of Eric Gray and Ty Chandler, had a big day in a rout over the Tigers, pushing Tennessee to 2-0. All right, guys, let's look forward to this weekend's games. The least interesting game on the docket, or the one maybe not getting too much attention. South Carolina. Mark, I want to come to you for some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I mean, are there must games for Will Muschamp? Because this seems like it would probably be one. I can't imagine it would be a wonderful scene in Columbia if they can't beat Vanderbilt after starting the way they started this season. So, the Commodores have been, I guess they were respectable in week 1, and we'll see what they can do against a South Carolina team that's desperate for a win.
Josh, coming into the season, I'm sure Auburn was probably thinking Arkansas was a game on its schedule that it can pretty well chalk up into the win column, but 2 teams, last week that walked away feeling differently when they exited the stadium after their game. So what does Auburn have to do this week to bounce back against Arkansas?
I don't think there's been a time in the last few years where Auburn has gone into a matchup with Arkansas feeling worse than Arkansas did going into that matchup. Looking at the schedule 3 weeks ago, you'd think, this is the game where Chad Morris and the Auburn offense is going to, put a hurt on his former team. Now the game has suddenly very high stakes. Auburn's 1-1. Fan base is mad. They're playing an Arkansas team that doesn't look like a pushover. And now you're thinking, if Chad Morris doesn't come out and Auburn's offense doesn't have a good game against his former team that was so bad for 2 seasons with him coaching it, people are going to start getting pretty fired up. So Auburn really needs to look good in this game. The way to do that, and the biggest way to do it, and it hasn't happened yet, is the offensive line has to block somebody. Not all the players in the other team, but just a couple of them, because against Georgia, they lived in the backfield. Bo Nix was on his back foot. He was running every play. The running backs carried 8 times for 31 yards combined. There was only 1 who got even touches. So the offensive line has to block for somebody, and the offense has to be able to get going, because Auburn's offense really can't afford to struggle against an Arkansas team that fired their Auburn's offensive coordinator as head coach last week.
Brett, you've seen Texas A&M in their game last week against Alabama. They host a really hot Florida team this weekend. This has been a game that I've heard discussed as, potential, maybe something's there for an upset. Maybe people are giving Florida too much credit or writing Texas A&M off too early. What do you see there? Does Texas A&M have much of a chance of slowing down the Gators?
I think they do. I think Florida has a pretty similar task on its hand that Alabama did, in that Texas A&M's defensive front is really, really good. The defensive line and the linebackers on that squad are very good, very disruptive. The secondary doesn't quite have that quality and the same abundance that the defensive front does. So if Kyle Trask can pick apart Texas A&M secondary like Mac Jones did, then they'll probably do something pretty similar that Alabama did, which is put up 40 or 50 something points, where even an average defensive performance is more than enough to win that game. And I think it's kind of an interesting referendum on Kyle Trask, because in what is sort of a down year for returning quarterbacks in the SEC, Kyle Trask seemed to be the one that was most highly thought of. So is he kind of the best of a bad crop, or is he truly a potential star quarterback at a place like Florida? This game against Texas A&M will be a halfway decent test for that.
Kind of a sneaky good game this week is Mississippi State at Kentucky. I mean, really a game that, I look at both programs and think they each need a win here. This is, when you look at the schedule, this is a game that, could go either way. And I think either side, is probably thinking it needs to fall in the win column for it. So I guess, do you see one side or the other maybe having an advantage in this one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Kentucky, I think they're a little bit more desperate. I mean, they might be, I don't know if they're the best 0-2 team in the country, but they certainly, could have won either of those games. I guess, Auburn obviously pulled away, but they went to Auburn and were, within a couple points in the fourth quarter, and then losing overtime at home to Ole Miss. Mississippi State will be interesting to see, if they're kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, if they come back and look like they did against LSU. And we talked about kind of the inconsistencies that Mike Leach had, at Washington State, great one week and not so great the next week. So I definitely think Kentucky, though, looking at an 0-3 start, definitely desperate, especially when they have another home game and have a chance, to maybe close one out this time.
LSU was supposed to be hosting Missouri this week, but due to a hurricane, that game has shifted to Columbia, Missouri, and so now Missouri will host the Tigers. Josh, we've seen LSU lose in surprising fashion to Arkansas in week 1 and then bounce back against Vanderbilt. What do you make of LSU? I mean, I think we all thought they were obviously overrated coming into the season, but did we maybe overcorrect going the other way and think they were rushed after that loss at Arkansas?
It's tough to get a read because they really haven't played a great opponent. I mean, Vanderbilt, probably the worst team in the conference. Then you go to Missouri, which, I mean, sorry, Eli Drinkwitz, you have to open your tenure at Mizzou with Alabama, Tennessee, and then the defending national champions, which that's as bad a welcome into the SEC as you can possibly get. But for LSU, it's a great spot, even if the game is being moved away from their home stadium, because in a season with no one getting any non-conference tune-ups, they lose that first game to Mississippi State, but then they get 2 tests that are about as easy as you can get in the SEC, we think, through 2 weeks in Vanderbilt and Mizzou. So we may have overcorrected by saying they're bums, they're done. I don't think a win over Vanderbilt proves they're great and a contender again, but being able to have these 2 games against lower level teams in the East may be enough to get the offense kind of rolling a little bit, which is what they need as the schedule will get tough for the rest of the year.
Brett, you got an interesting one this weekend with Lane Kiffin going up against his former boss and Nick Saban. And I guess I'll put it this way, none of Nick's former assistants have been able to get the best of him. Is Lane the guy to do it, or will it be more the same of Nick Saban beating his former assistants?
You and Mark on this call, who have former Saban assistants as your head coaches, y'all are uniquely qualified to speak to how they're basically trying to be Saban in a different location or recreate that Saban model. And it's difficult to do. That's why very few, if not no one, has been able to do it since. But Lane is kind of a different cat. He does things a little bit differently. There are some things that they obviously agree on in terms of program building and recruiting, but a lot of aspects of those programs are different. So I kind of wonder if if taking things a different way might end up benefiting Lane in terms of probability of knocking off Alabama one day. That isn't going to happen this year. Ole Miss's recruiting on the defensive side of the ball has been so bad for several years in a row now. They're just not in a place athletically to challenge Alabama. And frankly, it could be even worse if Hurricane Delta impacts things in Oxford and kind of neutralizes the pass game, because as I mentioned earlier, Alabama is replacing 3 starters in the secondary, and it was costly against Texas A&M. The Aggies put up 450 yards of offense on Alabama, and that number is boosted by a couple of coverage breakdowns that produced big plays for Kellen Mond and that Texas A&M defense. And then Ole Miss is highly talented at the wide receiver position and at quarterback with Matt Corral and John Rice Plumlee, Elijah Moore, and the core of wide receivers there. So they would be uniquely ready to take advantage of coverage breakdowns and mistakes that Alabama might make in its secondary. But if Hurricane Delta forces both teams to stay on the ground a little bit more and stray away from their passing attacks, that certainly hurts Ole Miss as a team that's probably trying to win this game in a shootout if they're going to win it at all.
That brings us to our game of the week, guys. It'll be one that Mark and I will covering. Number 12, Tennessee plays at number 3, Georgia. The Vols haven't beaten Georgia since 2016. They've had a rough go against all 3 of their main rivals. Of course, that's a tough sledding against Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. So it'll be a good test for Tennessee to see, are they ready to be serious contenders in the SEC East. I feel like for Tennessee to pull off the upset in this game, they got to do a couple things. One, they have to contain the run and make Stetson Bennett beat them. I think that's the best chance to have a hope in this one is don't let Georgia dominate on the ground, make Bennett beat them. And then 2, if you look at Georgia's 7 losses since the start of the 2017 season, the turnover margin has really gone in one direction, which isn't surprising. I mean, that's obviously a big factor in any game, but in those 7 losses, Georgia has 15 turnovers and just 3 takeaways. So those I think are a couple key factors that maybe could help the Vols pull an upset in this game if they are to do so.
The way Georgia's defense has played, it's hard to see Tennessee really being able to run the ball. And you wonder about the playmakers on the outside. Tyson Campbell shut down Seth Williams. Will Tennessee be able to make enough plays downfield? So it's hard to see, Tennessee unless they get, some breaks, some turnovers, and a Hail Mary again, maybe like in 2016. You got to like Georgia's chances at home.
All right, Mark, I will see you this weekend in Athens, and we'll all be back next week to break down the action.